A good-hearted officer named John notices a small boy, Marcus, sitting in front of an abandoned house every afternoon. John offers kindness without expecting anything in return, but soon realizes that there's much more to Marcus's story than meets the eye. As John uncovers the truth behind Marcus's quiet vigil, their connection deepens, and John's life changes forever in ways he never anticipated. What was it about Marcus's situation that moved John to tears? And how did their journey bring healing to both of them in an unexpected way? Let's find out. In the heart of Millbrook, a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, there was a house that time had forgotten, nestled at the end of Maple Street. It stood in stark contrast to the well-maintained houses lining the rest of the neighborhood. The two-story structure, once proud, now sagged under the weight of neglect, its paint peeling like old scabs, revealing the weathered wood beneath the windows. The eyes of the house, which should have shone with life and laughter, were now blind, covered with wooden planks that had long since grayed with age. The front porch, which perhaps once welcomed visitors with open arms, now sagged precariously, as if one more step would cause it to collapse onto the overgrown lawn below. That lawn, once neatly trimmed and cared for, had become a wild tangle of weeds and tall grass. Dandelions and thistles battled for dominance, their seeds carried by the wind to torment the meticulously maintained gardens of the neighbors who looked at the property with a mix of pity and disdain. A rusty mailbox hung crooked from its post, its flag always at half-mast, as if mourning the life that once filled the house. The cracked and dented driveway held nothing but fallen leaves and the occasional brave dandelion pushing its way through the cracks in the concrete. It was a house with secrets, with stories etched into its very foundations. The older residents of Millbrook would sometimes whisper about its past, tales of joy and sorrow, beginnings and endings. But those stories had faded like the house itself, becoming little more than a neighborhood legend. Yet, despite its dilapidated state, or perhaps because of it, the house had a visitor every afternoon, as regular as clockwork. A small figure appeared at the edge of the overgrown lawn. A young boy, no older than 8, with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that seemed too old for his young face. His name was Marcus, though few in the neighborhood knew it. To most, he was simply the boy who sat on the sidewalk in front of the abandoned house, day after day, rain or shine. He arrived just as the school bus dropped off the other children, his backpack still slung over his shoulders, and took his place. At first, the neighbors were curious. Mrs. Jenkins, the retired schoolteacher who lived 2 houses down, even approached him once. "Are you lost, dear?" she asked, her voice soaked with concern. Marcus simply shook his head, his eyes never leaving the boarded-up windows of the house. Mrs. Jenkins withdrew, unsure of what to do with the silent boy. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Marcus became a fixture on the street, much like the abandoned house. The neighbors grew accustomed to his presence, barely giving him a second glance as they went about their daily routines. But if they had looked closer, they might have noticed how Marcus's small hands clutched something hidden in the pocket of his worn jeans. They might have seen the slight tremor of his lower lip as he stared intently at the house, unblinking, and if they had truly paid attention, they might have caught the whispered words that sometimes escaped his lips, carried by the breeze before anyone could hear them. "I'm here," he murmured. "I'm still waiting." As summer faded into autumn, Marcus's vigil continued. The other children on the street rode by on their bicycles, laughing and calling out to one another, but Marcus remained apart. Sometimes, a curious child would slow down, watching the solitary figure on the sidewalk. "Hey, do you want to play?" called a freckled boy, precariously balancing on his bicycle. Marcus turned, his dark eyes meeting the other children for a brief moment before silently shaking his head and returning to the house. The freckled boy shrugged his shoulders, pedaling away to join his friends. The quiet and strange boy had already forgotten, but Marcus couldn't forget. He couldn't join their games or share their laughter. He had work to do, a promise to keep, so he sat day after day, his small figure contrasting with the imposing presence of the abandoned house. When the sun began to descend lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Maple Street, Marcus finally moved with a deep sigh that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond his ears. He stood up, brushing his worn jeans, his hand reaching into his pocket to pull out a wrinkled photograph for one last look before carefully putting it back. The photo, faded and worn at the edges, showed his smiling family. A man with kind eyes, a woman with the same warm skin tone as Marcus, and a younger version of Marcus himself, beaming widely at the camera. The house in the background was the same one Marcus looked at every day, but in the photo, it was vibrant and welcoming, nothing like the decrepit structure that now stood before him. As Marcus turned to leave, his eyes lingered on the house one last time, a mixture of hope and heartache etched on his young face, and then, with slumped shoulders, he began the solitary walk home, disappearing around the corner as the streetlights began to flicker on. The neighbors who, at that moment, looked out their windows might have felt a slight something, curiosity, concern, or perhaps a vague sense of unease. But when dinner was served and families gathered around their tables, the image of the lonely boy faded from their minds, replaced by the comfortable routines of their own lives. As night fell on Maple Street, the abandoned house remained silent and dark, keeping its secrets close. But tomorrow would bring another day, and with it the return of the boy who waited, his presence a constant reminder of an untold story. In the stillness of the afternoon, a gentle breeze whispered through the overgrown grass, carrying with it the whispered echoes of laughter and love that once filled the house, and somewhere in the darkness, a small boy clutched a photograph to his chest, holding on to hope with all the strength his young heart could muster. Officer Mike Donovan had been patrolling the streets of Millbrook for over 15 years. At 45, his graying hair and the laugh lines around his eyes spoke of a life well lived. Known throughout the neighborhood for his kind demeanor and approachable nature, Mike was the type of police officer who preferred to solve problems with a kind word rather than a stern warning. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon that Mike first noticed the boy sitting in front of the abandoned house on Maple Street. While passing in his patrol car, he slowed down, his eyes drawn to the small figure perched on the sidewalk. Something about the boy's solitary presence touched Mike's heart, but he continued his route, thinking he was just a child taking a break on his way home from school. The next day, Mike saw the boy again in the exact same spot. This time, he paid a little more attention. The boy sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the dilapidated house across the street. Mike frowned slightly, but kept driving, his mind already turning to the next stop on his patrol. As the days passed, Mike found himself looking for the boy each time he drove down Maple Street. Without fail, the boy was there, a constant presence in front of the abandoned house. At first, Mike tried to ignore his growing concern. Sometimes, children do strange things, and if the boy wasn't causing any trouble, was it really his business? But something about the situation bothered him. The boy's unwavering routine, the way he sat so still, as if waiting for something that never came. It all seemed deeply unusual to him. After a week of driving and seeing the same scene, he decided it was time to investigate. On a sunny Tuesday afternoon, Mike pulled his patrol car onto the sidewalk, a few houses down from where the boy sat. He got out, adjusting his uniform and taking a deep, very deep breath. Approaching children could be tricky, especially for a police officer. The last thing he wanted was to scare the boy. As Mike approached, he could see the boy more clearly. He was small for his age, perhaps around 8 or 9 years old. His clothes were clean but worn, suggesting limited care with limited resources. However, what caught Mike's attention most were the boy's eyes, dark, serious, and filled with a sadness that seemed too deep for someone so young. "Hello, young man," Mike said softly, stopping a few meters from the boy. "Do you mind if I join you for a minute?" The boy's eyes blinked toward Mike for a moment before returning to the house. He gave a small shrug, which Mike took as permission to sit on the sidewalk beside him. "I'm Officer Donovan, Mike," Mike continued, keeping his voice gentle. "But you can call me Mike if you want. I've seen you sitting here a few times. Is everything okay?" For a long moment, the boy said nothing, just as Mike was beginning to think he wouldn't get a response. A small voice broke the silence. "I'm waiting for someone." Mike nodded slowly, his eyes following the boy's gaze toward the abandoned house. "I understand," And who might that person be? The boy's hand moved, then reached into his pocket to pull out a small, worn photograph. He held it carefully, almost reverently, but did not offer to show it to Mike. "My parents," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mike felt his heart constrict. There was a story here, one he suspected was filled with pain. "That's a long time waiting," he said carefully. "Do you come here every day?" The boy nodded, his eyes never leaving the house. "What's your name, son?" Mike asked kindly. "Marcus," was the silent response. "Well, Marcus, it's nice to meet you," Mike said, offering a warm smile that the boy didn't see. "You know, it's starting to get a bit chilly out here. How about I bring you something hot to drink tomorrow? Would that be all right?" For the first time, Marcus turned to look directly at Mike. His eyes were cautious, but there was a glimmer of something else too, perhaps a hint of hope or gratitude. He nodded once more and then returned to his vigil. Mike slowly stood up, brushing off his uniform. "All right then, Marcus. I'll see you tomorrow. Take care now." As Mike returned to his patrol, his mind raced. Clearly, there was more to Marcus's story than met the eye, and he was determined to unravel the mystery, not just as a police officer, but as someone who couldn't bear to see a child in pain. True to his word, Mike came back the next day with 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate. He found Marcus in his usual spot, looking small and vulnerable against the backdrop of the imposing abandoned house. "Here you go, Marcus," Mike said, holding one of the cups carefully. "It's warm now." Marcus accepted the cup with both hands, his fingers wrapped around the warmth. "Thank you," he murmured, taking a small sip. Mike settled onto the sidewalk beside him, holding his own cup. They sat in compassionate silence, sipping their hot chocolate and watching the abandoned house as if it might suddenly come to life. In the following weeks, Mike made an effort to stop by and see Marcus every day during his patrol. Sometimes he brought hot chocolate, other times a sandwich or a pack of cookies. Marcus never asked for anything, but always accepted Mike's offerings with silent gratitude. Slowly, Mike began to piece together Marcus's story. The boy didn't say much, but each little revelation painted a picture of loss and longing that broke Mike's heart. One day, while sharing a bag of chips, Marcus suddenly spoke. "My mom used to make the best cookies," he said, his voice melancholic. "With chocolate chips and nuts. The whole house smelled like them," he added. Mike nodded encouragingly, not wanting to interrupt this rare moment of openness. "Dad always tried to steal one before they cooled," Marcus continued, a shadow of a smile crossing his face. "Mom would pretend to be mad, but she always winked at me when he wasn't looking," he said. The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a look of sadness so deep that Mike had to resist the urge to hug the boy. "I miss them," Marcus whispered, his small hands clutching the worn photograph he always carried. "I'm sure you do, buddy," Mike said softly. "It's okay to miss them. Can you tell me what happened?" Marcus shook his head, withdrawing into himself once more. Mike didn't press, knowing that trust takes time to build, especially with a child who had clearly been through a lot. As the days grew colder, Mike's concern for Marcus deepened. He began bringing an extra jacket with him, draping it over the boy's shoulders when the wind picked up. He noticed that Marcus always wore the same clothes, clean but increasingly frayed. As the weeks passed, one particularly cold afternoon, while Mike sat beside Marcus with their now regular hot chocolates, he decided to address a topic he had been avoiding. "Marcus," he said kindly, "I was wondering where you go when you're not here. Do you have someone who takes care of you?" Marcus tensed slightly, but neither ran away nor completely shut down, which Mike took as a good sign. "My aunt," the boy said, after a long pause. "She works a lot." Mike nodded, processing this new information. "And does your aunt know you come here every day?" Marcus shrugged, his eyes fixed on the abandoned house. "I don't know," he replied. "Marcus," Mike said carefully, "I want you to know that if you ever need help, any kind of help, you can always come to me, day or night. I'm here for you, buddy." For the first time since they met, Marcus turned to look directly at Mike. His eyes were cautious, but there was a glimmer of something else too, perhaps a hint of hope or gratitude. He nodded once more and then returned to his vigil. Mike felt his own eyes welling up. "Because we all need someone in our corner, Marcus. And I'd like to be in yours if you'll let me." Marcus said nothing, but he didn't need to. The way he slightly leaned toward Mike, accepting the comfort of his presence, spoke volumes. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Maple Street, Mike knew he had to return to the station. But as he stood to leave, he felt a small hand squeeze his. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Marcus asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. Mike gently squeezed the boy's hand. "I'll be here, Marcus. I promise." Walking back to his patrol car, Mike's mind raced. Clearly, there was more to Marcus's story than he knew, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. But more than that, he was committed to being there for this boy who had somehow found his way into his heart. As he drove away, Mike glanced in the rearview mirror. Marcus was still there, a small solitary figure against the backdrop of the abandoned house, but for the first time, the boy raised his hand in a small gesture of farewell. It wasn't much, but to Mike, it felt like the first ray of sunshine breaking through a long, dark night. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. He would do everything he could to help Marcus find his way back to the light. If this video has helped you connect more with yourself and inspired you on your growth journey, take action and subscribe to the Vidasto Inspiration channel to discover more stories that will fill you with motivation and hope. I would love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment telling me how this story has impacted your life or what reflections it has left you with. And if you think this message could inspire someone you know, share it with your friends so they too can find inspiration and purpose in their lives.